So here we go, right? Welcome everybody. Welcome to this Wednesday session of the Hadrian's Wall Networking Day. And I've got to, I suppose I should introduce myself because I'm assuming everybody knows who I am. I'm taking over chairing today. I'm John Scott. I'm the World Heritage Site Coordinator. And basically my role is to work with all of the partners, organisations and individuals all the way along the wall. I've pretty much got the best job in the world. And I just kind of bob along, helping people out, adding a bit of extra capacity where I can, getting in the way, and I'm just trying to see whether I can make life a bit easier and go forward. Often people refer to me as a team of one, but actually I think it's a team of thousands because I include you lot in it. Everybody that works at Housesteads, all the WallCAP team, yada yada, so on and so forth. Everybody's going in the same direction, and everybody so far that I've met is incredibly positive and incredibly energetic. So yeah, best job in the world. Right, the first session of the day is Jane Harrison, and I've been looking forward to this because we're going to get a lowdown on all the exciting excavations which have been happening across Hadrian's Wall. And I've made a point of trying to get out and see them in action. And I first saw Jane and Catherine in a little bit windswept up on top of Hadrian's Wall, but they were absolutely soaked. They were absolutely covered in mud, but they were absolutely beaming like Cheshire cats from one side to the other. And it was blowing a gale, and you couldn't hear each other speak. And we were only 6 foot away from each other, and they were going, "Yeah, but I'm digging on Hadrian's Wall." They're quite enthusiastic and quite into this. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Jane to share her screen, and I'm going to sit back and just enjoy this next hour.
Right, thanks very much, John. I'll just say right at the beginning that I know that there are a lot of people here who were with us on quite a few of the excavations, but some of you who weren't. So those who are fairly familiar, will you excuse me if I give background to those who aren't, so that we were all on the same page, on the same screen. So, as John said, we've conducted with WallCAP a number of excavations along the length of the wall over the last 2 years, and it has been an enormous privilege. We've had a great time, and the results are now beginning to come together, and I'm going to think about what we've learned and why it matters. There's always that moment when you think, well, why does it matter for the future of the wall? And obviously we did do important work in consolidating and looking after the wall in various places and provide information that's going to assist with managing it in the future. But at the moment, I'm buried in post-excavation analysis. And that's when you really begin to answer some of the questions and see what was important and key about the work that we did in the excavations. And that's from the most nerdy wall detail on stone and wall widths to broader ideas about how the wall was built and how it decayed and how it interacted with the landscape. But all the way through, you're so aware and you're reflecting on the impact that what we did had on the people who worked with us. And the wider importance of that is captured on this slide, that it's local people who were central to what we did. And here we've got us discussing the day's work at Corbridge. We've got Lee developing his troweling as well as his guitaring techniques. Everyone hard at work at Cambeck, drawing and thinking, and hard at work at the top, recording. So dozens of you invested your time and learned how to excavate, to record, to draw, and in the process, to understand more about the past of your place and about how your predecessors shaped the landscape and your cultural heritage. You brought ideas, you brought existing skills quite often, and you were really keyed into our on-site discussions and thinking. So we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you all again. All you diggers, the landowners, the farmers, and everyone who is involved. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm focusing today on the two bigger excavations that involved a considerable number of volunteers. And so that's Cambeck and Corbridge. But you can see on the slide, on the map, the black length of Hadrian's Wall snaking across the country, and the red circles, which are all the excavations that we did, from Port Carlisle through Cambeck to Walltown Crags, to the consolidation work at Peel Gap and Cat Stairs, to the work on the Valham at Hedden, and the excavations at Corbridge this last summer. So I'm going to start with Cambeck, which, as you saw, was in the west, so in the area where the turf wall precedes the stone wall, and in the area where there is almost nothing surviving of the wall above ground, and where there have actually been fewer investigations overall. For those of you who don't know, on the right is a map of this stretch of the wall, and you can see the location of Milecastle 57, which is more or less under Cambeck Hill Farm, which is built of wall stones, essentially. And you can see the location of turret 56B and the possible location of turret 56A, and with our site marked in a little purple triangle. Now, Cambeck is really interesting for a lot of reasons, and one of the reasons is that the fort is off the wall, which is an entirely unusual arrangement, and makes you think, well, why was that? There are a number of things I'm going to sort of throw up for discussion about that. One of the things may be to do with views. The fort is on a higher bit of land. You can probably just about see that in the contours, and has a really good view to the sort of northwest in particular, up towards the rougher ground. And I'll talk about why the wall may be running in this particular location a little bit later. And you can see that the other thing about this is that the fort is on one side of the Cambeck, and the wall is on the other side of the Cambeck in one portion. And at some point it's got to cross the Cambeck. And one of the reasons that we targeted this site was that we know nothing about minor bridging points of the wall over becks and smaller streams and rivers, so that was really important. And also because the gorge of the beck, and it is quite steep-sided, isn't part of the scheduled monument, and we need some more information about what's going on there for future management. And that mid-19th century map gives you a nice idea of the location of the fort overlooking the beck, but also of the steepness. It's narrow but quite deep, as the beck has bitten through, it's seasonally very strong, the soft red sandstone of the local geology. So here we are, just homed in a bit on where the site is. You can see there it is on the east bank of the Cambeck. The west bank here is 4 meters higher than the east bank. So you've immediately got a technical, a challenge in bridging here, because you're not going from one side to another straight across. You're going to have to deal with that difference in height in some way. And there's a weir just upstream of where the bridging point is, and that's partly natural, where the beck comes over a harder part of the local sandstone, and it's been built up. And one of the questions is, are the stones that have been used to build the weir up reused Roman stones? So that was one question that we were also trying to deal with. And the photograph just gives you an idea of what the weir looks like, and of the kind of, again, that steepness of the gorge there. And just quickly to look at the geology of the Cambeck area, you can see here we are. There's the crossing point. Here's the site with the weir just upstream, where near where the path is. And all surrounding the site, we've got sands and gravels of river terraces, and the sands and gravels of glacial and glaciofluvial deposits. But we've also, along the narrow incised gorge of the beck, got the local soft red sandstone outcropping. It's very near to the surface. You can see it in the sides of the gorge. And I think that's really important. It may be that created a better point to take the wall across the beck. And it may also be that having that relationship between the fort and the wall meant that between the fort and the wall itself, there were also other better fording points for bigger traffic that was safe within the wall fort envelope, as it were, because there are fords between where the wall crosses and the area of the fort to help with getting over the beck. So here we are. Here's the site open, and on the final day when we used a drone to get some aerial shots, and you can see the red, the effect of the red sandstone is all very, like Kerry, red. But we were incredibly excited with what we discovered in this relatively small trench, because we picked up the wall, and believe me, that is the course of the wall crossing the trench, and we found it in the remains of the rubble core of the wall, which was mostly made up of cobbles from the local soft red sandstone. The occasional harder sandstone that may have come, for example, from the Gelt quarries further south, the occasional bit of limestone, and we found a couple of facing stones which were made of made out of harder sandstone, but they'd used the local stone for the cobbles of the wall core. Two very clear robber trenches where all the facing stones have been robbed out at a later date. But very excitingly, not just the wall core, but other structures as well. And you can see some white, harder cobbles up here. They're the foundations of a tower that was next to the stone version of the wall, and possibly also the turf wall. Because remember that even when the turf wall was constructed in turf, Castle's towers, ancillary structures were stone. So it's likely this tower was built alongside the turf wall, and lasted, and then was also incorporated into the rebuilding in stone. And that was also surrounded by a robber trench, so we could see the size of it running into the bulk. But underneath that, we found some deposits that we thought looked very much like turf wall, which would suggest that at this location, the turf and the stone walls were running on the same alignment. And I'll come back to the turf wall. And then also we found a building 1, which was probably built around the same time as the tower, so early on in the sequence, and had a beautifully laid cobble floor with a stone, at least stone founded wall running round it, and a built-in oven and hearth. Now, that was demolished or destroyed, and there was a buildup of soil before building 2 was built. You can see here, over here, a rather less grand structure. It was built likely with wooden walls and with a rubble and clay floor, and was probably contemporary with this other structure, a ramp. And this ramp was built of, again, rubble and clay. It's butting onto the stone version of the wall and takes a width up to the bridging point. So we've got a later, wider construction for the bridge up to the crossing of the beck. So that's a really interesting sequence, and the buildings are quite a unique thing so far. We did find a couple of facing stones. One of them is hiding in there. I don't know if you can just about see it. And we found this in the later destruction levels, this one big stone, which absolutely matches what you have in the weir, which suggests that those are stones from the bridging structure, which were reused in the weir. So here's everyone at work at Cambeck, just to give you a little closer view of some of the structures. Here you can see this is very early on in the dig. You can see the foundations of the tower structure and the spreads of developing subsoils that formed over the destruction of the buildings and the ramp and the wall. And here, these are deposits of burnt material and stones that are part of the demolition that are being explored. And here Catherine is drawing the cobbles of the first building. Again, you can see some of them here in the corner. You can see the foundations of the tower. And here, volunteers working on the stone foundations of building 1. And here just a close-up at the top of that big stone that matches the weir stones, and looking east across building 1, where you can see a bit more clearly the fine cobbling of the floor. Here's the hearth in the corner. And here you can see the stone foundations of the wall of that building. And building 2, you can see less impressive, with that clay and rubble floor and a wall trench surrounding it, likely to be for wooden foundations. And just to emphasize some of the statistics, this is a site plan of that aerial shot that you saw. It looks like the curtain wall was between 2.5 to 2.6 meters wide, which makes it absolutely within the intermediate wall measurements. And as I said, local red sandstone rubble with occasional harder cobbles. And there were our phase 1 and our phase 2 buildings and the ramp. And just to give this to you, to emphasize this sort of phasing, the sequence that goes on. This is my working Harris matrix. It's what I'm using as I'm building the story of what happened on site. All the red boxes are the structures, and it's a sort of chronological sequence that starts down in the natural, the undisturbed geology, and works, up the page to the topsoil right at the top here, 2000. And so you can see that at the bottom, we've got the tower and the wall. This is the turf wall at the bottom, the stone wall and the tower and the first structure together in one phase. Then you get demolition and new soils forming. This is sort of demolition areas of the later wall, which should go further up the page. This is my working document. And then you can see this crucial phase 1, phase 2. Here's the second building and the ramp. So that's a really interesting sequence that we'll be exploring further when we get the radiocarbon dates back. Now, I want to talk a bit about the pottery. There wasn't an enormous amount of pottery, but there was some really interesting material. These, we had some sherds of these large globular rounded amphorae, the Dressel 20, which you can see a picture of here next to a sherd that we found on site. These were made in Spain from about the later 1st into the 3rd century AD, and we used to export olive oil. They held up to 80 litres of olive oil. But due to the porous nature of the fabric, they were only used once for olive oil, and which is why we find so many sherds of them all over the empire to where the olive oil was exported. We also, interestingly, found these 7 valley wares. And these were produced down in the Severn Valley from the 2nd to the 4th century approximately, and distributed mostly across Western Britain. You don't find them very often in North Britain, so they were a nice find. And also there were some other sandy wares, and also this black burnished ware. You can see a picture of a cleaned up version of this black burnished ware with some of our site finds here, sorry. Now, these are this black sandy ware, had a nice burnished surface, and they're typically jars, but you can also get flat rimmed or flanged bowls and plain dishes. And they sometimes have a nice burnished lattice decoration or sort of intersecting arcs. And they're produced down in Dorset and were distributed through Britain, across Britain from the mid-2nd to 4th centuries. And the forms, the black burnished ware forms of jars and dishes became the dominant ones in a lot of the local industries later on in the Roman period. So that gives us the diagnostic ceramic sherds on site were mostly early to mid-2nd century, which is that period turf wall to stone wall. So that's quite interesting, and they tied in nicely with that sequence, that story that we were building up of buildings and bridge structures. Now, we've also had the results back from our environmental samples, and all of you who worked on our sites will be very pleased to know that all the samples we collected at Corbridge, Hedden and Cambeck all produced not just environmental information, but material that can be radiocarbon dated. So that's very exciting. It will mean we'll get some good radiocarbon dating sequences to go along with the pottery dating. So charred plant remains, there weren't an awful lot. Hardly surprising in that very acidic sandy soil, which is very mobile, but there was cereal grain, there were heather stems and some wild and weed plant seeds. The hearth in particular in the building 1 and the layers associated with building 1, they were the ones where we really got the cereal appearing and the wild and weed plant seeds, which fits with having an oven there and having some kind of space where people are living. But perhaps the most exciting result was from the sample that was taken from what we thought were the turf wall foundations, and we thought we could see the shapes of the turf, because that produced a high concentration of evidence for a soil-dwelling fungus, which the environmentalist says is absolutely consistent with the interpretation of this as a layer of turf. So that was really nice confirmation of our interpretation on site. There are also quite a lot of wood charcoal fragments, particularly again in association with the buildings, which will help with dating. And mostly those were local hazel, birch, alder, hawthorn seeds, with the occasional bit charcoal, the occasional bit of oak, ash or elm. And absolutely no hammer scale in any of the environmental samples. And we'll come back to hammer scale at Corbridge. And you can see on the picture there were some iron finds and the nice find of this lovely little whetstone, which would have been used probably for sharpening a dagger or possibly even a sword. It's quite nice and fine. So just to wrap up with Corbridge and with Cambeck, I think really interesting. The sequence of tower and ramp matches what happens on the major bridging structures and suggests a widening of bridges over watercourses later on in the early 3rd century. And suggests, I think, at Cambeck, what we found, that the bridge is being taken up higher on the east bank to go level across to the west side, and also that the findings of the buildings at Cambeck suggest that there may be structures that haven't yet been discovered at places like Willowford, where you can see that not dug area is exactly where we found buildings at Cambeck. So a lot of interesting information, and the radiocarbon dating is still to come. Right, and now Corbridge. Again, we had some lovely drone shots to help with our interpretation. And here you can see our 2 trenches, trench 4 on the right, trench 5 on the left, looking towards Corbridge Roman Town, the English Heritage Site. And if you can kind of hold that in your mind as I go onto the next slide, that will help with you visualizing what's going on. So this was in summer 2021. As you see, north of Corbridge Roman Town, we're looking south, and we excavated 2 trenches. And you can see here, this is looking north. You can see the red rectangle at the top is where our 2 trenches were. And you can see the outlines of the buildings are preserved in Corbridge Roman Town. And the interesting thing to note is this road here, which would have been running through the field you saw in the first slide. And that's running up towards our site, and is important because here we are looking across our 2 trenches. And it's looking east, and this road that I've marked, and which we had partly in trench 4, is a spur off the road that I just pointed out in the overall plan of the town that we had on the previous slide. And just to go back to that, if you notice alongside this road, there are lots of long, narrow buildings fronting onto it. And this is exactly what we've got going on in our 2 trenches. In trench 5, in the distance there, we have one of those long, narrow buildings fronting onto this spur road. And we think from trench 5 that there is a building just outside in which we were working mostly on the backyard of it. So here is a close-up from the drone of trench 4. And trench 4 investigated that this is half of the road, so there's another half of it up here, and it's running west-east. And we found that that road had several phases. It had been narrower at an earlier point, it had been widened, and one of those phases included this lovely roadside conduit that you can see here, beautifully built stone walls, stone bottom, and flagged over to create crossing points. The other phases of the road had roadside ditches. And then to the south there, you can see that we were working in what had been an externally and partially paved yard, which at one time earlier on had a small building within it, and that's around here. And it looks like that in the final phase, and we've lost most of this to the later ploughing and disturbance, the road was being built across and may have gone out of use or been rerouted in some way, because this looks like we've got some kind of major structure here. And these are stones associated with a major building to the east. So we have a yard with activity in it, and I'll come back to what that was because we've got some proof now about what was going on, with small buildings in it and with paving. And then after a period of levelling and destruction of what was going on in that yard, which may have been later associated with further buildings, a really interesting set of ditches and pits are dug into this area. And you can see here, this is a collection of pits, and I'll come back to talk about this in more detail. But in those intercutting pits, there was a considerable and exciting collection of near complete pots, including both Samian and large courseware vessels. And the activity here is focused on the later 2nd and into 3rd centuries. So let's talk about the pottery in Trench 4. So generally the pottery sherds are in pretty good condition, a lot of large and very crisp edged pots, so the sherds haven't been disturbed a good deal. And in fact in Trench 4 and to a lesser extent in Trench 5 there were several complete and near complete pots, and 9 of them had holes that were being put in after manufacture, which suggests change in use or repair. There was a great variety of fabrics. They came from Yorkshire, Dorset, southeast of England, Cambridgeshire and the West Midlands, and then of course from further afield, amphorite from Spain, Gaul and North Africa, and other pots from Germania and Gaul, and a considerable collection of Samian. One of the amphora sherds may have had a potter's graffiti, and that's been examined now by our specialists. Most of the sherds are from jars, so big jars, I'll show you a picture later, but also from flagons and beakers and bowls and dishes. And those in Trench 4 will remember the hefty size of some of those amphora sherds. There were also mortaria sherds, the mortaria used for grinding herbs and mixing sauces. There was finer dining and serving pottery, including decorated Nene Valley beakers and the shiny red ornate Samian bowls and cups. And you can see these, just out of the ground, looking quite extraordinary. And this very large greyware, this is the bottom of this huge greyware jar, which was found in that corner, those intersecting pits I pointed out to you in Trench 4. And you can see it upturned at the top right of the slide with one of the holes showing it had 3 neatly arranged holes pierced into the bottom of it. And this pot, which was will have been complete when it went in, was stacked with pots above and around it, including decorated greyware bowls and Samian platters and bowls. And the environmental sample that was taken from the inside of this big greyware jar was a very, very high concentration of burnt bone and nothing else. So that's really interesting because this large pot with burnt bone inside it, with stacked and nice pots around it, we interpreted on site as a deliberately arranged deposit. The pottery specialist, Eniko, suggested that this arrangement of complete pots around a large central jar suggested a structured placement rather than just a rubbish pit. And this, whatever we call this burial, may have been made during a ceremony to mark a significant occasion. It may be a cremation burial. There's a bit more analysis that we need to do on this. And now looking just a bit more closely at the Trench 4 Samian, which is a really nice collection. And here you can see rubbings that the Samian specialist has done from the sherds themselves. There were 312 sherds. 88% of them were from Central Gaul, and there were a proportion from East Gaul, and the dating is this late 2nd into the 3rd century, and 4 of them had potter's stamps. Now, the Samian from the pit feature in Trench 4 was particularly interesting because we had effectively the greater part, if not all of, 5 different vessels, all of which were late 2nd century. So this including the other pots that were stacked around that big greyware pot. One of them was a Central Gaulish bowl with a mould stamp on it, and you can see the rubbing of it D5 at the top left. And there were 17 sherds of that, which was a complete bowl. And there was a large East Gaulish dish, very wide diameter, and then this very interesting Central Gaulish flanged form, which means it has a flange at the top. But the flange had been removed and rubbed flat deliberately, and the interior was unworn. So that's a really interesting pot that has been included in this deposit. So the pottery in Trench 4 was in particularly good condition, and it suggested that the features we found, the pits, the road, and those structural remains, including the yard floors and the walls, were dating broadly from the later 2nd to later 3rd, but we'll get radiocarbon dating, possibly focused on the early 3rd century, but that's only from the diagnostic pottery, so the radiocarbon date will help to open that out as a date. There weren't typically 4th century pots, and it's possible, and probable, that archaeology later than around the later 200s has just been destroyed by the subsequent plying and landscaping of the site. And most of the pots in the trench, aside from the pit feature, were associated with serving and dining, as well as storage of food, and may well have been associated with that house that we think was east of Trench 4 and in whose backyard we were essentially working. Right, so this is Trench 5. And Trench 5 uncovered, you can see the rectangular base of the walls. We had phases of this rectangular building. And there was an eastern annex, which is here at the top of the slide. The artifacts from which suggested more of a domestic use. And the building itself was fronting onto the road and included the main building, a large oven and a trough, and other small structures which suggested a possible link to some kind of commercial use. And this, the activity here may have started a little later than in Trench 4 and carried on a bit later, but that may be just to do with the preservation. And you can see this is the trough here. And this is this sort of oven feature, which we'll talk about a bit more. The pottery was rather different. It was dominated by these sort of big grey wire storage jars and cooking jars. And they, Samian sherds, there were some, but they were smaller and scrappier, and there were also smaller amphora sherds. But they even more so, it was serving and dining related bowls and beakers that were dominating this pottery assemblage, perhaps linked to the domestic finds in the eastern part and the annex to the building, or perhaps to the production and selling of food and drink from a building fronting onto the road. So overall, the pottery and the structures fit with, dating-wise, with the establishment of the town at Corbridge and the main site. And it suggests the town was of a considerable size from very early on in its history. It either expanded very quickly or was conceived from the outset as quite an extensive settlement. And in our area, people were storing food and cooking and serving and eating it, and some of that food was being served in some style. And the origins of that pottery suggest the wide trading connections of the town. Now, just upon the environmental samples from Corbridge, there weren't that many charred plant remains. There was some cereal grain, including spelt wheat. We had hazelnut shells, some heather stems again, and wild and weed plant seeds. In Trench 4, the cereal grains were found mostly washed into the water conduit and the roadside ditches, and within that little earlier structure in the yard. In Trench 5, the cereal and the hazelnut shells were concentrated in the oven fill and in the associated probably drain and trough. Now that cereal grain is likely to have been charred accidentally during parching or drying and cooking, and suggests, that you've got domestic hearth or oven waste, or in this case possibly commercial oven waste. And the heather is linked to the use of plants from grasslands or heaths for fodder for animals, for roofing, or for bedding, for fuel, or even for construction. There was a lot of wood charcoal found, and again, it was mostly in the oven fills and the drain trough fills in Trench 5, and in Trench 4 in the water conduit, and in the ditch side roadside ditches. And the interesting thing is, no hammer scale at all at Cambeck. Here, Trench 4 had quite a lot of hammer scale in those water conduits and ditches. The only characteristic slag that there was suggested that there was smithing going on in the vicinity, and that was Trench 4 was the focus of that. So somewhere there was smithing going on, and there was a lot of little small fragments of nails, and not surprisingly, and of hobnails. So just here we are, more people at work at Corbridge. Just to give you some little close-ups, you can see the lovely water conduit being drawn. This is the early stages of excavating those intercutting pits in Trench 4, and you can see the large chunks of pottery in the tray here. And this is further on in the excavation, when the removal of these near complete pots is beginning to attract a little bit of a crowd. And you can see also volunteers carefully recording things as we're going along. Okay, so just to sort of wrap up with Corbridge, what we're getting is a picture of the size of Corbridge and the things that were going on in terms of people living, things being made, and the establishment of commercial premises as well. So there's more material to come, and again, more radiocarbon dating to be done. We're really, more evidence will be able to pull together about Corbridge. Now, just look. I think I'll go very briefly over the other smaller sites, which were ones that we had to work on without volunteers during COVID, just to summarise the main points that have come out for those who haven't heard previous talks on this. Now, right over on the far west was the site at Port Carlisle, where we were working to consolidate and stabilise this tiny surviving bit of wall above ground. That's it, for this whole area. And basically, by removing the gate from this location and moving it over to another location where the wall had been completely removed by the building of an agricultural farm building, and then fencing that off and consolidating and protecting it. And what we found from our work there was how significant the closeness of the Solway Firth is, I think. You can see on that geology map here underneath that both Marcastle 79 and this little stretch of wall are on a higher piece of glacial till where there's harder geology. And what the wall has done is it's tracked that harder geology, which is also a bit higher, as a way of placing the wall where it's a bit safer from the high tides and the neap tides. And what we indeed found is that drainage is clearly a huge subject in this part of the world, and that the wall has been part of that story over the centuries, with drains running alongside it and through it. And indeed, where the wall core and the line of the wall has survived, it's because it's in important hedge boundaries that have been kept and with drains running alongside them as part of the management of the area. And just to sort of indicate, to highlight that, you can see this is the line of the wall with a drain running alongside it. The purple triangle is where we were digging, and you can see the crop mark of the Raelict estuary bank along which the wall is tracking. It's this thing that what we found very much with these smaller sites is that they emphasise the diversity of approaches there have been by the builders of the wall to local conditions, to the resources they have in terms of the stone and the turf, to the ground conditions, to the topographical nature of the landscape, and they're using that. So they're not blindly following a prescription from above, they're responding to what's on the ground. And you can see these lovely 19th century drawings that indicate that already by the late 19th century, the wall had been reduced pretty much to the core where it was useful as a hedge, and that only little pieces were surviving of the facing stone. And I think that drawing may even have been of the bit that we were working on. Now, Walltown, which is in the area in that dramatic craggy central section, you saw the picture on the first slide, is also this area here is west of the area that was worked on in the 19th century. So it's unadulterated wall, but it's also an area where quarrying has taken out big chunks. And what we found here, and we were working in two little trenches on this area where there's some of the wall has been uncovered and there's a bit above ground and the rest is still underground. Again, what we found was that they were responding to local ground conditions. The wall here, this is bedrock, is built on bedrock, and they're using little chalk stones to level up the first courses of the wall and then build in a more conventional way above it. As you can see here, this is lovely, unchanged, original. This is why John found us grinning like Cheshire Cat, to uncover that beautiful stretch of wall with its lovely glowing pink stone. We don't know why that's there. It was so exciting. And it also gave us a chance to look at how the wall had decayed as it was robbed and hit by the wind and the weather. And what was also interesting is if you then look at what we found there with the wall built on bedrock, is that here in turret 45A, it's founded on bedrock, and you can see the same sort of using of chalk stones to hold it up. And here, this lovely bit of sinuous wall that's running again over bedrock, just close to where we were. And then finally, just briefly at Hedden, we were looking just at the vallum. And again, it's about response to local conditions, because the vallum here is very close to the wall, which runs underneath the B road here, much closer than it is in other places. In order to capitalise on the terrain here, the vallum is on an open brow with a steep drop to the south of it. And we were looking at how it had survived in a very heavily ploughed field, where the soil marks showed how the mounds either side of that big vallum ditch. I mean, what a big construction effort that vallum was. Huge ditch with two mounds, not right next to it, but moved back either side of it. And in this field, it had just hung on, and we were able to look at a long section of it, pick up the remains of the two mounds, and to see how they get material from the ditch and put it into the mounds, and just marvel again at the enterprise that went into that. But again, responding to what they had available locally. Okay, I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions after all that.
Thank you for that, Jane. That was amazing. What a collection of sites. I wanted to ask, given your opportunity to dig across the length of Hadrian's Wall over the course of this particular project, has that changed your view of what Hadrian's Wall is and how it works? And have you got, I think you kind of touched on this, have you had a different opinion of the people that built it maybe as a result of that?
Yes, I mean, I think absolutely. The people who built it, I mean, one thing is that you are blown away by the effort that went into it, and in some extraordinarily difficult conditions. I mean, there, Catherine and I were only up there for 10 days working on Walltown Crags, and it wasn't the mid it was late autumn, but it was blinking hard work. And if you were doing that for week after week after week after week, and even more physical than we were, but it's not just the effort; it's also the imagination and the responsiveness, because it flexes the wall. It is built, and I suspect there will have been some centurions who were more imaginative and more responsive than others, and they're the places where the wall is particularly well adapted to its local surroundings. I don't know, but you just got a feel of someone standing there going, I've got to do this. I've been told I need to do this. How am I best going to do this where I am? And I think that those were the things that as you marveled at the variety and diversity of the landscape and the resources available, came to mind.
It's just great to immerse yourself in the wall that much, isn't it? And to find those differences and see the decision-making processes behind them. Now, I've got a feeling that there was an awful lot in your talk and people were avidly watching. I was looking at a few faces while the talk was happening. So there's nothing for me to go through in the chat at this moment in time. But I think that there's going to be a number of questions. Now, we've got Jane for the next 10 minutes. We do have to close this session before we go into the next session to record stuff and technical wizardry stuff that Catherine's tried to explain at least 10 times to me. But while we've got Jane here, are there any questions? Please raise a hand or an emoji hand, or make yourself known to me, and I'll flip between the two screens and I'll do my best to try and pick you up.
Sorry, there's a lot of information there, I know. When it's me, I always need to go away for half an hour to think about it.
Never apologise, Jane. There were some amazing images and some amazing sort of observations that you made. So is there any questions that you want to ask Jane while you've got her here? Lee's raised his hand. Lee, unmute and go for it.
It's not a question. It's just saying that that's exactly why I volunteered. Seeing all of that afterwards is just incredible, absolutely incredible, and why I want to continue. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and you know, it is a genuine thank you that we give, because we couldn't have done it without you. And I have to say, you know, the atmosphere on the particularly Corbridge and Cambeck, where we had all of you, was brilliant. Everyone was so engaged and focused and so willing to bring, you know, in a way it was mirroring what John and I were just talking about, the sort of thinking about people responding to local conditions. You were all responsive and ready to say, okay, well, how do we best do this? Why are we doing this? You know, let's see how we can do it the best we can. And that was terrific. So it is a genuine joy to have been working with the group of people who are WallCAP volunteers.
I remember finding the first nail at Cambeck, and I just basically wanted to hold it above my head and run around the field shouting.
Feel free next time, Lee. That's what we all feel like, really. It doesn't go away.
Yeah, it's just astounding, the work that is being done. I'm looking at Neil's face, and I stood next to him for at least 1 or 2 days scrubbing bits of pot at Corbridge, and absolutely enjoyed it. And I'm sure there's going to be a few things that come out of that. Yes, been on a few digs. Yeah, that's an understatement. Jane, you've got your hand up.
Jane and Catherine, why do archaeologists still draw when we have mobile phone photography technology?
Okay, now this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, Jane. I'm glad you asked that question, because the drawings, in a photograph, you get a beautiful sense of the colours and textures. A drawing is to scale. It's absolutely, so you even when you do 3D photography, what you can't get is a scale drawing that is interpretative. When you draw, and all the people who did the drawings know this, as you're drawing, you're making decisions about how that feature, the wall or pit or ditch is working, and you are adding in your knowledge into that drawing. So it doesn't just capture a to scale picture, it also captures all the thinking that has gone in. And the two are not mutually exclusive, they're absolutely complementary, and you can do wonderful things combining aerial drone shots with 3D photogrammetry with our on-site drawings. And people are experimenting with using iPads to do the drawing digitally. I mean, still to scale drawing, but doing it digitally. And I think it's a very personal thing. I think a lot of people find that connection with the pencil and the paper somehow helps your thinking process. So it becomes quite a subjective thing, but it is an important part of the understanding and the interpretation. And you have to confront your understanding of what you're drawing when you engage with it like that, in a way you don't when you just click a camera shot.
That's really fascinating. May I ask a volunteer, when you volunteer though, are you worried if you think you don't have drawing skills? You know, obviously we talked yesterday a lot about your training, but you know, I'm really rubbish. So are you nervous then when you are asked, you know, to take on that new skill? May I ask a volunteer if they could?
Neil's just put a comment in the chat about it, but also Lee, I don't know whether either of you want to respond to that.
Neil, Neil, I know you were very anxious about it, weren't you?
Absolutely terrified. And I have a photo that Jane kindly gave me on another dig, and I'm going to draw a section, and I'm actually, as I'm walking towards it in the photo, you can actually see me leaning backwards in sheer terror. But the sort of training and support we got, you don't need to be artistic. If you pay attention to what you're taught and take it slowly, it works. Although in my case, I still make a god awful hash of it. But that's all you need to do. Pay attention to what you're taught. The support is there. Make sure your pencil's sharp and have a big rubber.
That's a rule for life, Neil, surely.
A big rubber one.
Wait till you see the results, Neil, and you see in that drawing we've captured all that work you put into excavating that pit. Sorry, Lee, you were
Lee, what did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it gives you a greater idea of like the spatial awareness as well, because when you were drawing things in the trench, the way I was doing it anyway, I was kind of, rather than just take a snap photograph, when you were drawing it, you were sort of looking what was around that area as well, and it kind of relates to the space around what you're actually drawing as well. It gives you a more understanding of what was actually in there rather than just taking a quick photograph.
Yeah, you have more of a relationship, don't you, Lee, when you draw? I've spent my time drawing microliths, little tiny bits of flint, which was hours of fun. The therapy is going well. And they all look like sheep when I draw them, because I can only draw sheep. Gail, you made a comment in there about also being very nervous with drawing. Did you want to add anything to that, or was that what you wanted to say?
Can I just, I've just noticed a bit of this John in the chat asking about the final reports.
Yes, yeah, go Jane with that.
And the ones for Hedden and Port Carlisle and Walltown Crags and the Peelgout ones are up on the website. The final interim reports, and we have to add in Hedden the environmental results to that. And the other ones, of course, are bigger and take a bit longer, but they will be available for you to see by summer at the latest. So, that will then be incorporated into books and chapters and articles, but there will be a version for you volunteers to see those, by summer.
Paul asks, what's left for the remainder of the project in terms of excavation? I presume that's what you meant, Paul, in terms of digging and so forth. What's left for the remainder of the project? No
more digging, sadly. We wish, but as we talked and often discussed on site, you have to write it up. The days we spend in the field are multiplied, by a huge number for the days down. I know, Lee, but we would love just to be out there digging more and more and more. But that's you can't do that. You've got to. We want now to get it published and for you to be able to see the results of your labours and to see the results of all that effort that you put in, and then we can go off and think about what we're going to dig next. But we will do, I'm sure.
Responsible archaeology requires you to cover that post-ex, doesn't it, in that sense? Rose asks, will the finds be on display to the public anywhere? I think, is that going to be touched on in the exhibitions thing later on today, by any chance?
I'm not sure about that. If they talk about one specifically from the excavation, not absolutely certain, but I imagine some of the things from Corbridge will end up in the museum at the Corbridge site, because some of that beautiful Samian and things that we had was definitely museum worthy. Who knows? I mean, I don't think we're certain about that yet, but I'm sure that some of it, particularly the Corbridge material, will be on public display.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, there's more comments from Neil as we go along, and definitely what a team, a dream team. I'm going to say that I'm going to wrap up because we're getting to the end and we do have to do those practical things. I have the pleasure of being the chair of this project's steering group, which is the most pointless job in the world because it's such a great team that they don't need steering. So I kind of come together and drink their coffee and then go home again and go, they're doing good stuff. But they're not doing good stuff on their own. They're doing good stuff because you were there. And I want to say a massive thank you on behalf of everybody along the wall for that. This is a really comprehensive. When I saw that map of the excavations along Hadrian's Wall, I was like, wow, that's just amazing. What a cross section, to use that word out of context or in context in this particular discussion. Thank you for all your time and effort that you've put in. You don't know the discussions that this team had when COVID struck and how upset they were that you couldn't join in with those excavations that were happening and they had to do them solo. But they were gutted by that and they had to rechange the format of the project and so forth. But it's been a pleasure to sit on the shoulder of this project all the way through. It's been a pleasure to have an opportunity to see it in action. And it's been a pleasure to work with this team. And it's such a shame that we're coming towards the latter stages, but we'll find a way to go forward, I am sure. Are there any last minute questions for Jane and even Catherine while we are here? If not, I will say thank you very much to Jane. Round of applause, everybody, if you wish.